All right, here is proof that I have 5 individual people here for my speech. We are not allowed, I'm going to hand the camera over to Janice. We are not allowed to, you can just hold it and make sure that you capture me at least from the waist up.
Okie dokie.
And no pausing or anything like that is allowed. So.
All right.
Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate you coming to listen to my speech. I'm going to talk about Cuba, more specifically about Operation Pedro Pan, or Peter Pan. The reason I chose this topic was because I feel like it's important to understand how the events in history can affect people's lives and how they live their lives today. I'm going to talk to you about Cuba before the revolution, after the revolution, and how Operation Pedro Pan came to be. At one time, Cuba was described to be the Paris of the Caribbean, but Cuba has not always been just fun and games. So first I'm going to talk to you about before the Cuban Revolution. I have a PowerPoint here for you guys to follow along if you'd like, but you need to point it at me because...
Okay.
So before the Cuban Revolution, Cuba's economy was largely owned by U.S. companies. The U.S. was the largest importer of Cuba's sugar and controlled 90% of its utilities. Cabaret Quarterly of 1956 described Havana as a mistress of pleasure, the lush and opulent goddess of delights. Here in the next slide, you can see where at one time you could make a round trip from Miami to Cuba with only $42. And you can see that casinos were open, glittering fun capital of the Caribbean. These are all flyers from back then, prints from back then. And the next slide, you can see where, a few older pictures of people indulging in some of this fun. Casinos, getting a pedicure, dancing. The nightlife was very lively in Cuba before the revolution. So sometimes people would say, well, what happened? Sorry, my mouse is being funny. So people would say, why was there a revolution? What happened? What people didn't know in the background, the tourists weren't aware of the workers, the sugarcane cutters, the people that worked. They worked for 4 months out of the year and slaved, and then the rest of the time they were unemployed. There was poverty. The leader of Cuba at the time, his name was Fulgencio Batista. He was thought to be corrupt and abusive. Anybody who opposed him could be killed. Batista used his military to threaten political opposition. He allowed Havana to become the center of organized crime by the American mafias. So it was bad times. So that's when Fidel Castro came in. This moves me into the next topic of after the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro promised the people, liberty and that things would be better and they wouldn't be corrupt. But instead he started to transform Cuba into communism. He overthrew the government in 1959, and over $1 billion worth of property owned by American were seized. You can see where that would be a bit of a problem. He held public trials and executions. He had relationships with the Soviet Union. It was not good times. So this is how Operation Pedro Pan came into play. In November of 1960, there was a Cuban man who brought a 15-year-old Cuban boy up to the office of Father Walsh, director of Catholic Welfare Bureau. The boy Pedro had come to Miami to live with relatives, and the family was in dire needs. They didn't have any money, and the the Catholic Welfare Bureau provided foster care and funds. Father Walsh realized that unaccompanied minors were always found among refugees seeking a safe haven. In other words, they were fleeing Cuba and they were coming here on their own with nothing, with nobody. And so he knew that there would be many more considering the circumstances and how things were in Cuba. He had President Eisenhower approve funds for their care. Cuban parents, fearing the indoctrination and that the Cuban government would take away their parental authority, exercised one of the most fundamental human rights, the right to choose how their children would be educated. So because of this budget, because of their right to choose their education, and because this director, Father Walsh, made this happen, between 1960 and 1962, 14,000 kids were brought over from Cuba to, if they didn't have families, they had this budget, so they would be provided foster care and care for themselves.
So did any of the parents come with them?
No,
Just the
it was
kids?
just the kids. The
Wow.
parents weren't allowed to come, which brings me to my third topic. My mom was a Peter Pan child. They call them Peter Pan children or Peter Pan children. My mom and my aunt were 5 and 7 years old. So if any of you have kids, you can imagine that you have to, it's scary with the conditions that Cuba was. It's very scary. You're taking your children to the airport, and some of these parents weren't sure because things continued to get bad after that, even worse. So some of these parents had no idea whether they would ever see their children again, but they were putting their children on this plane to potentially go to a relative's house. Luckily, my grandmother had a sister that lived in Miami because she was already living there before everything became bad. The children weren't told anything. They were just told that they were going to visit a relative in the United States. Everything was kept top secret because if it was so bad, the communism was so bad that if you mentioned in school for one president or the other, there was a fight between the two. If you mentioned anything, you could get shot right in your home. And people were, anybody who rebelled against the current government could be shot down in their homes. So the description of this, according to my mom, was, the kids were put, and many others, I've talked to other people about this, the airport was a fishbowl. So when they went to the airport, they were put in they were separated from their parents. So they couldn't even be together until the time that they got on a plane. They were in this fishbowl, they could see each other. So my aunt and my mom, it was a little traumatic for them, a lot traumatic, because something was wrong with my mom's visa, and they pulled my mom back. So my aunt, at 5 years old, she had to go by herself to a relative that she never met before in her life. And my grandmother is seeing this from the other side of the fishbowl. My mom ended up going to a couple months later and reunited with her sister. And it wasn't great times because, she went with an aunt who never had children, who wasn't terribly responsible. She kind of partied a lot. So it was not a good time to live with an unknown relative. My grandmother left Cuba just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, they shut down everything. They shut down the airports, they shut down any kind of, so my grandmother was able to come literally just a month or two before, and there's children who were never reunited with their parents. There's children who, their parents never got out or never were able to come back to the United States, but luckily for me, my grandparent, my grandmother, was able to come, and they were able to live, a successful life here. So I feel very fortunate because, who knows if the tables were turned, what it'd be like. I have heard stories about, You know, I had heard a gentleman tell me about he came and he had to live with a foster parent, and he didn't know he lived with a foster parent for 2 years before his parent came back, and he didn't know his parent at that point. He was scared to go to his parents. So a lot of, here's a few pictures of children getting off the plane. This is getting off the plane in America. You can see they're uniting with some family members, maybe some social workers, and you have the kids lining up. It's a really sad little story. So, like I said, the reason that I chose this topic was just to remind everybody that everyone has a story. And since I'm a quote junkie, you know, I'm going to put a quote in there. The world judges me by the decisions I make, never does it see the options I had to choose from. And I think that a lot of people in history have really gone through a lot of things that we will never know today, or we will never understand, and it's important to take that into consideration before we decide that we're going to make a decision about how or why they do things. My last slide is just a bibliography, a list of sources that I use. I use Wiki, the A to Z library for Santa Fe Community College, which was awesome, history.com, peterpan.org, and mashable.com. So I hope you enjoyed my speech. Thank you.